folks, welcome to part 3 of my multi-part series, How Jesus is the Messiah. If you've not yet checked out the earlier parts of the series, please go on my channel and do so now. Thanks! As I was publishing the last part of this video series, part 2, word was coming in that very same day about a recent terror attack that took place in Boulder, Colorado. An Egyptian man using a homemade flamethrower attacked a peaceful crowd of marchers who were marching in solidarity for the hostages that had been taken in the October 7th attacks on Israel. And unfortunately, this type of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic violence has been on the rise in recent weeks. This comes on the heels of 2 Israeli embassy workers that were killed outside of the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., only blocks away from where the Declaration of Independence is on display at the National Archives that I talked about in the last video. The victims of this anti-Semitic hate crime, Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram, may their memory be for a blessing, weren't just Jewish, however. They were also Messianic. They were followers of Jesus as the Messiah, or in Hebrew, Yeshua HaMashiach. And it seems that there's almost never a day that goes by that doesn't bear some sort of news event that relates directly or indirectly to the conflict in the Middle East between Jews and Palestinians. A conflict whose origins ultimately go back centuries, if not millennia. So how did we get here, and what does any of this have to do with showing that Jesus is the Messiah? One of the key issues at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about which side has rightful claim to the land of Israel, with both sides making historical cases to support their arguments. And this modern conflict really starts in earnest in the wake of World War II, from the very start of Israel becoming an independent state again in 1948, to which the Arab world quickly rose up in armed opposition. Now, prior to that time, Israel had not had any sort of formal state in the land for nearly 2,000 years, having lost it under conflicts with the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. And in the subsequent centuries that followed, remnants of that Jewish population were scattered throughout various parts of the globe, oftentimes suffering varying degrees of anti-Semitism and persecution in the various places that they found themselves. Some more well-known examples of these instances being things like the Spanish Inquisition or the Russian pogroms, or, most famously, the Holocaust of World War II. But in the midst of that exile was always the remembrance of the land and the capital of Jerusalem and the temple, the things that they had lost under the Romans, and the desire burning in their hearts to one day return and rebuild. And so, for centuries, Passover meals have ended with the phrase, Lashana Haba'a Barushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And this hope is also similarly mirrored in Maimonides' 13 Principles of the Jewish Faith that we talked about in the first video. One of them being the belief that the Messiah will come. And in Rabbi Maimonides' famous code of the Jewish law entitled the Mishneh Torah, we read the following: In the future, the Messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty. Restoring it to its initial sovereignty, he will build the temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. Now, Maimonides was writing this in the 1100s A.D., long before any sort of restored Jewish state that occurred after World War II. But one cannot help but wonder, given the events that have occurred around the land of Israel in the last 100 years or so, is the Messianic age soon upon us? Or from the Christian perspective, is Messiah soon to return? As of today, no Jewish temple has yet been rebuilt since its destruction in 70 A.D. The location where it once stood is now occupied by a Muslim holy site, the Dome of the Rock. And with regards to the global Jewish population, more than half still reside outside of the land of Israel, not yet having returned or been gathered to their homeland. Now, according to a Pew Research study, more than half of the population of the planet identifies with an Abrahamic faith, mostly divided between Muslims and Christians, and certainly Jews will be included within that as well. But you can see why this is the most disputed piece of real estate anywhere on the planet, being of such importance to more than half of the world's population's religious faith. But none of this was yet the case at the time that Jesus had his earthly ministry. He would have been mostly completely unknown and irrelevant to the almost entirely pagan world that surrounded Israel. The temple was still yet standing, and the majority of the Jewish population still resided in the land of Israel. In the Gospels, in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus spoke about the coming destruction of the temple, which had not yet happened in his day. In verses 1 and 2, we read, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him, for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Today in Jerusalem you can still see some of the stones that were thrown down in the destruction that occurred in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. And Jesus also said to his disciples in verse 9 that, "Ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake." At this time, this was only taking place in Israel. And in verse 14 also Jesus says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." Today, most of the world has at least heard of the name of Jesus, which would suggest that we are fast approaching his soon return. In 70 AD, as I mentioned, the Romans came in and destroyed the temple complex, some 40 years almost after Jesus had uttered those words that we read in Matthew chapter 24. All that remains today is the platform, the temple foundation on which those stones once stood, known as the Temple Mount. As the elevation changes on the western side of the Temple Mount, a large retaining wall still stands which helps keep in place the Temple Mount platform. This wall, known as the Western Wall, is not part of the actual temple itself or any of the buildings that once stood on the platform above. Those are all thrown down just as Jesus prophesied. But it is the one last remaining thing that is held as sacred and holy by Jews all around the world, as a reminder of the temple that once stood there. Even though the temple and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, this didn't bring a total end to the conflict between the Jews and the Romans of that time period. Some of the last holdouts took refuge in a mountaintop fortress known as Masada near the Dead Sea that would not be taken by the Romans until a few years later. Likewise, you had uprisings amongst the Jewish diaspora in the early decades of the 2nd century AD, probably the most well-known of these being the Kitos War, and more famous than that even, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place from 132 to 136 AD, that really brought an end as we know it to the ancient Jewish state, not to be revived again until 1948. Eusebius records that at the end of that conflict, the Emperor Hadrian banned all Jews from even entering the district of Jerusalem. However, later Roman emperors would allow the Jews to return and lament and wail the loss and destruction of their temple on one particular day each year, the anniversary of its destruction. This exposed section of the Western Wall where lamenting has taken place for centuries on this date known as Tish B'Av has become to be known as the Wailing Wall. But now let's fast forward from the destruction of the temple in the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD to the modern political movement that calls for a restoration of the Jewish state known as Zionism, which started in the late 1800s. The name is derived from Mount Zion, one of the oldest inhabited portions of the city of Jerusalem where the ancient city of David, the king, once stood. But Zion has come to be associated with, in a poetic sense, the city of Jerusalem or the Temple Mount or even, in some instances, the land of Israel itself. The modern Zionist movement was founded by a man named Theodor Herzl in 1896 in the wake of anti-Semitic instances that were occurring in Europe, in which Theodor Herzl felt that the only real solution for this was for Jews to have their own land. This began some of the earliest waves of settlement for Jews returning back to the land of Israel, but also within that, some of the first seeds of the conflict with the Palestinians who were living there at the time. The real watershed moment, however, for the Zionist movement to create a Jewish state in Israel was something known as the Balfour Declaration, which occurred during World War I. In an attempt to elicit Jewish support during the war, the British government issued a declaration to the Zionist movement declaring their support for an independent Jewish state in Palestine. At the time, Palestine had been under the control of the Ottoman Turks for hundreds of years, but that changed as a result of the war. In December of 1917, the British commander Lord Allenby took control of the city of Jerusalem, marking the first time that a Christian nation had taken control of Jerusalem since the Crusades. He purposefully dismounted from his horse and entered the city on foot in order to show his humility and also to distinguish himself from prophecies about the return of the Messiah. The British control of Palestine lasted until 1948, and when it ended, in keeping with the Balfour Declaration, Israel became a state again for the first time since the Roman Empire. But the newly formed state did not comprise all of the same land that it once held in ancient times. In 1947, the year before the end of the British control of Palestine, the United Nations had approved a plan to divide the land into two separate states, one to be controlled by Israel and the other to be controlled by the Palestinians. Jerusalem was to be designated as an international city controlled by neither side. In reality, however, things didn't go exactly as planned. As soon as the British occupation ended, the Israelis, as expected, declared their independent state, but the Arab world, in support of the Palestinians, immediately went to war against the new state of Israel. Yet, defying all odds, Israel was able to emerge from the war victorious and not be annihilated by its Arab neighbors. However, the 1949 Armistice Agreement, which formally ended the war, left the eastern half of Jerusalem under the occupation of the Jordanians, and that included the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. Therefore, Jewish control of the Temple and the Old City of Jerusalem would have to wait a bit longer. But then hostilities broke out again between the two sides in the 1967 conflict known as the Six-Day War. And once again, despite all the odds being against them, Israel emerged victorious, even capturing eastern Jerusalem and the Old City, including access to the Wailing Wall and the Temple Mount. However, given the religious and political sensitivities of the Islamic holy sites that were already existing on the Temple Mount, an agreement was worked out between Israel and Islamic religious authorities that would allow the Jews unhindered access to the Western Wall while allowing Muslims unhindered access to their holy sites as well. This very fragile status quo agreement remains in place today, although not without its historical incidents. Now I want to tell you a little bit about this woman. Her name was Pauline Rose. Pauline was born to a Jewish family in South Africa in 1898, and then married a Jewish man named Albert, and later moved to London in 1931. In 1946, 2 years before the end of British control of Israel, Pauline traveled to Jerusalem and helped to establish a synagogue there. In 1948, in the midst of the Israeli War of Independence, she returned again to Jerusalem to continue her work, and was caught in the siege there, experiencing the turmoils of war while trying to help her neighbors amidst the bullets and shells. She was later captured by a Jewish paramilitary organization known as the Stern Gang on suspicion that she was a British spy. However, this being unfounded, she was later released. She then traveled back and forth to Europe for some time before finally returning again permanently to Israel in 1959. At this time, she was presented with a bold idea. Inspired by the scripture Isaiah 51:3, she thought to start a garden on, of all places, Mount Zion. And at the time, the hilltop of Mount Zion, which was within the confines of the city of Jerusalem, was the military border between the Jordanian-controlled eastern Jerusalem and the Israeli-controlled western Jerusalem. This militarized zone was only occupied by abandoned houses and the two opposing armies holding their positions opposite of each other. But the scripture that inspired her reads as follows: "For the Lord shall comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places, and he will make her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness shall be found therein, thanksgiving and the voice of melody." So, with that determination in mind, she began with her husband to petition the Israeli government to allow them to take up residence on war-torn Mount Zion as a symbol of hope for the blossoming and restoration of the nation of Israel. And after a couple years of denials, they finally relented, granting her permission to a house that was within the gun sights of the Jordanian forces, abandoned and overrun by pigeons and rubble. But Pauline transformed that house into a place of beauty and hospitality. They called it Ha'ochel, which is Hebrew for the tent, hearkening to the tent of Abraham, whose character was one of showing tremendous hospitality towards others. And this unique home up on Mount Zion soon became noted for being just that, a place of hospitality, by Pauline Rose and her husband, who entertained for Sabbath dinners Christians, Arabs, Jews, people from all different walks, and fostered communication and understanding in a place that nobody expected. She soon became known as the Lady of Mount Zion, and her idea of ministering to her community around her flourished much like the garden that she planted, which was only a stone's throw away from the tomb of King David. But then suddenly in 1967, that very same house found itself right on the front lines of the Six-Day War. After some time, some of the fighting began to advance forward, and some of the officers thought to take the opportunity to experience some of the noted hospitality of Hao Hao by taking time out for some coffee as they prepared for their final advance on the Old City. And as they began to discuss the battle ahead and the historic significance of what was about to happen, the reacquisition of the Temple Mount in the Old City for the first time in almost 2,000 years, they realized that they didn't have a flag with them to hoist to show that this sacred area was now finally back in Jewish hands. And so, hearing this while serving them coffee, thinking quickly, Pauline Rose went upstairs and grabbed a white bedsheet and a can of blue paint and a stick from her garden and made a makeshift Israeli flag. And this is that flag, becoming the first Jewish flag to fly over the Old City of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount area since they had lost it from the Roman Empire. Just like the roses in her garden, a symbol of the blossoming of the nation of Israel in its homeland. But here's the part I didn't tell you. That synagogue that Pauline Rose planted in Jerusalem all those years ago before the Israeli War of Independence was a Messianic synagogue. Pauline Rose was a follower of Yeshua, of Jesus. It was the first Messianic synagogue ever planted in Israel. And part of Pauline's mission in life was not just to see Israel restored again to its homeland, but also to share the gospel amongst the Jewish people there. The events that we see in modern times are a direct chain result from events that took place in the first century. It starts and ends with Jesus. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was an eyewitness to the events of 70 AD, had this to say as the primary reason for the cause of that war. But what more than all else incited them to the war was an ambiguous oracle, likewise found in their sacred scriptures, to the effect that at that time one from their own country would become ruler of the world. There was only one first-century Jew that could possibly fulfill the oracles or prophecies from the Jewish sacred scriptures about being the anointed king of the world, the Messiah. And that one person is Jesus Christ. Now in the next video, we're going to explore the scriptures and some of these prophecies that prove that only Jesus can be the Messiah. So you definitely won't want to miss that. Stay tuned to my channel for part 4 coming soon. Okay, bye!